She had never seen America the way people described it, full of dreams, lights, and endless opportunities. For her, the USA was simply a place where survival felt like a daily exam. At 68, Ameena sat quietly on the wooden steps outside the small apartment she cleaned for over 20 years, rubbing her tired hands together as if trying to erase the ache of all the years they had served others. Yet behind her weary smile lived a story no one truly knew, a story of a woman who crossed oceans not to find comfort, but to build a future she would never get to enjoy herself. She whispered to herself, maybe dreams aren't meant for everyone. Maybe some of us are born just to build them for others. But what if the world finally heard the story of the woman who gave everything without ever asking for anything in return? Ameena's journey had begun decades earlier, long before the wrinkles around her eyes told the story of sleepless nights and silent sacrifices. She had arrived in the USA with nothing but a worn-out suitcase, a faded photograph of her daughters, and a heart full of promises she had made to them. Promises that she would send money, keep them in school, and ensure they had a life better than hers. But the reality she faced here was harsh. She worked in 3 homes a day, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and ironing clothes until her back felt like it would break. Still, every paycheck she earned went straight back home. She often skipped meals, sometimes slept only a few hours, but never once failed to send what she had promised. Because for her, motherhood didn't stop at distance and love didn't depend on comfort. But the world didn't know that behind every dollar she sent, there was a night where she cried quietly into her pillow, wishing her children knew what she was sacrificing for them. There were nights when Ameena would sit by the tiny kitchen window of the apartment where she lived, just a small room in the basement of a stranger's house, and stare at the moon. She believed the same moon shined above her daughters back home, and somehow that kept her connected to them. But sometimes a painful question would rise in her heart, one she could never silence. Do they really understand why I left, or do they think I abandoned them? She would hold the photograph close to her chest and whisper, Amy didn't leave you, she left her world to save yours. And maybe you understand this too. Kaya aapani bikabi a isa misus kiyahay? That you are giving everything for someone, yet they might never know the price you paid. But Ameena didn't know that soon. Life would test her love in ways she never imagined, and the truth would cut deeper than distance ever did. Every morning before sunrise, Ameena would step out into the cold streets of New Jersey, her thin shawl barely protecting her from the icy wind. She walked slowly but steadily, holding onto the railing whenever her knees trembled. The world around her rushed, cars speeding, people hurrying, city lights flickering, but she moved at a pace shaped by years of exhaustion. Yet, despite her tired body, her heart always carried one silent prayer, Kuda kare meri betiyan mujeze kabi sharminda nahon. Sometimes, while wiping kitchen counters or folding laundry in the home she worked in, she would overhear mothers calling their daughters to wake up for school or reminding them to eat breakfast. Those simple sounds would break her from the inside, reminding her of the mornings she never got to witness with her own children. She would pause, close her eyes, and let the ache settle before continuing her work. But she didn't know that fate was preparing to reveal truths that would either heal her heart or shatter it completely. As the years passed, Ameena's name slowly faded from the memories of the people she worked for, but it also began to blur in the lives of the daughters she had sacrificed everything for. The phone calls grew shorter, then less frequent, until they came only on Eid or birthdays, formal, polite, almost distant. She would wait beside her phone for hours, hoping to hear a warm, Ami, how are you? But instead, she heard rushed voices saying, Ami hum busy hain bahad main bat karte hain. Each time she smiled and said, Si ka beta, even though something inside her cracked a little more. She often wondered if her absence had created a void in them, or if it had erased her place in their hearts entirely. Still, Ameena kept working, sending money, and holding on to a fragile hope that one day her daughters would understand the depth of what she had done for them, even if the world never knew. But destiny was quietly writing a chapter that would force Ameena to face the truth. Was her sacrifice building a future, or was it slowly destroying her heart? One winter evening, while dusting the shelves in a wealthy family's home, Ameena found an old children's book tucked behind a row of magazines. She opened it gently, and inside was a handwritten note from a mother to her child. May you grow with love, not loneliness. The words hit her like a wave. She sat down on the floor, the book trembling in her hands, and wondered how many memories she had missed. First steps, first words, school results, birthdays, every moment that makes motherhood feel alive. She had traded all of it for survival. That night, as she walked back to her basement room, snowflakes melting on her shawl, she felt an ache in her chest, not of age, but of years lost. For the first time, she whispered to the night sky, "If I had chosen differently, would my daughters have chosen me too?" The question lingered like smoke in cold air, refusing to fade. But little did Ameena know, a letter from home was on its way, one that would change everything she believed about her sacrifices. A week later, Ameena returned from work to find an envelope slipped under her door, thin, wrinkled, and carrying the handwriting she had memorized years ago. It was from her eldest daughter. Her hands shook as she opened it, hoping for warmth, longing for affection, but the words inside felt colder than the winter outside. Her daughter wrote not to ask how she was, but to request more money for household expenses and school fees. There was no, "Amie, we miss you," no, "How are your knees?" Just a list of needs, as if she were an ATM in a distant land. Amina's eyes filled with tears as she folded the letter back into the envelope. She sat on her thin mattress staring at the peeling paint on the wall, letting the silence grow heavier around her. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what happens when a mother becomes just a provider and nothing more." She didn't blame them. Poverty had a way of stealing softness from hearts. But somewhere deep inside, a part of her still longed to be loved, not just needed. But what Ameena didn't know was that this letter would be the push that set her on a path she never imagined, one that would turn her pain into a purpose far bigger than herself. The next morning, Ameena carried the letter in her pocket as she walked to her cleaning job. With every step, she felt the weight of her years, her sacrifices, her loneliness. At the bus stop, she saw a group of schoolgirls laughing, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward the shelter. One of them dropped a notebook, and when Ameena picked it up to hand it back, she noticed the child's bright smile, the kind her daughters once had. For a moment, she felt something warm inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. As the girl thanked her, Ameena wondered how many children back home were fighting the same battles her daughters once faced: poverty, lack of education, a future uncertain. And then, in a fragile moment of clarity, a thought struck her. What if her sacrifices were meant for more than just her own children? What if there were other girls whose lives she was destined to change? The thought frightened her, but it also lit a spark in her heart that had long been forgotten. But Ameena had no idea that this small spark would soon grow into a fire, one that would change not just her destiny, but the destiny of countless girls waiting for a chance. That night, Ameena sat at her small wooden table with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She kept replaying the moment with the schoolgirl at the bus stop, the bright eyes, the gratitude, the innocence. It stirred something deep within her, a memory of her own childhood when she too had dreamed of studying beyond the village walls. But poverty had clipped her wings before she ever learned how to fly. "If only I had been given a chance," she whispered to herself, tracing circles on the table with her finger. Slowly, an idea began forming in her mind. Soft, fragile, almost unbelievable. What if she used a portion of her savings, not just for survival, but for meaning? She knew she was old, tired, and often invisible to the world around her. But maybe she didn't need strength to make a difference. Maybe she only needed intention. For the first time in years, Ameena felt purpose tap gently on her heart. But she didn't yet know that this quiet night, in a dim basement room, was the beginning of a movement that would one day echo through generations. Ameena spent the next few days wrestling with her thoughts, torn between fear and possibility. She had never started anything on her own, not a business, not a project, not even a small stall back home. Her entire life had been spent serving others, cleaning their homes, raising their children, building their comfort. But this time, the dream was hers. She imagined a small classroom in her village, painted in soft colors, filled with little girls holding pencils instead of burdens. She imagined teaching them to read, to write, to dream. Everything she was denied. The thought alone brought tears to her eyes. "Maybe," she whispered, "this is why God brought me so far, not for myself, but for them." She placed her hand on her chest, gathering courage she didn't know she had. And before she knew it, she made a decision that would transform her life forever. She would build a school for poor girls, even if it meant giving the last of her strength, her savings, her years. If this moment in Amina's journey touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support reminds storytellers that these unheard voices still matter. With her decision made, Ameena began saving every extra dollar she could. She cut down her own expenses, skipping warm meals, walking long distances instead of taking the bus, and buying secondhand clothes even in the freezing cold. Every coin she tucked away felt like a brick in the foundation of the school she dreamed of. Late at night, she would sit on her thin mattress calculating numbers in a small notebook, her eyes filled with both exhaustion and determination. "Maybe I can start with just one room," she whispered. "Even one room can change a girl's destiny." She reached out to a distant cousin back home, asking him to search for a cheap piece of land in the village. The cousin was shocked, confused, even doubtful. How could an old domestic worker living abroad think of building a school? But Ameena didn't let mockery break her spirit. After all, dreams born from pain often grow stronger than dreams born from luxury. But while Ameena fought quietly for a dream the world couldn't see, life was preparing a test that would ask her to choose between her past and her purpose. Just when Ameena felt she was finally moving closer to her dream, a phone call shattered her fragile calm. Her younger sister from Pakistan was crying uncontrollably. Their mother, Ameena's last emotional anchor in the world, had fallen severely ill. "Aap, Dr. K. Rahaihayan K. Wakt Bohat Kam, Rake Gaya Hai," the sister said in a trembling voice. Ameena's hands shook so violently that the phone nearly slipped. For a moment, the walls of her small room spun. She had spent years holding everyone else together, but suddenly she felt like a scared little girl again, oceans away from home. Her heart screamed to go back, to hold her mother's hand one last time. But the reality hit her like a storm. Her savings were just enough to buy a plane ticket or keep her dream alive. If she used the money to travel, everything she had sacrificed for the school would collapse. Her mother would have never wanted that, but she was her mother. How could she not go? Amina's tears soaked her pillow as she whispered into the empty room, "Allah, main kya karun?" And in that moment of impossible choice, Ameena realized that dreams and love both demand a price. But which one was she meant to pay? Ameena spent the whole night sitting by the window, staring at the glowing lights of the city that had taken so much from her, yet given her a purpose she couldn't abandon. Every memory of her mother flashed before her eyes, her soft hands oiling Amina's hair, her whispered duas, her gentle voice saying, "Tum kisi din bohat, badi kam karogi." Those words felt like they were burning inside her chest now. At dawn, after hours of crying, praying, and breaking silently, Ameena finally made her decision. She would stay. She would finish what she started. She would fulfill the dream her mother planted in her heart, even if it meant never hearing her voice again. When she called home to explain, her sister's quiet sobs cut deep, but then came a slow, trembling whisper. "Ameena kahatha, Ameena apni manzil zaro puri karegi." Ameena fell to her knees, clutching the phone, as though holding her mother's blessing through the fragile connection. It was the hardest acceptance she had ever made, but she knew this sacrifice would define her journey. And that day, Ameena learned that sometimes the greatest courage is choosing a dream even when your heart is breaking beyond repair. The days that followed were heavier than any burden Ameena had ever carried. She returned to work with swollen eyes and trembling hands, but no one in the house understood the storm inside her. She moved from room to room like a silent shadow, dusting shelves, folding clothes, cooking meals, while her heart replayed her mother's last days over and over. Yet something within her had changed. Every plate she washed, every stair she scrubbed, every dollar she saved felt like a brick being laid for the school she dreamed of. She began writing ideas in a small notebook: how many rooms the school would need, how many girls she could teach, how she would keep the fees free. It became her lifeline. Every night before sleeping, she would whisper the same words into the darkness. "Ami, main apaka sapna pora karungi. Chahahe, kitni bideri ho jaye." Slowly, grief turned into determination, and determination turned into strength. And little did Ameena know, the world was about to test that strength in ways she could have never imagined. A few months later, when autumn painted the American streets golden, Ameena received a phone call that shook her world again. This time, not from back home, but from the family she worked for. The youngest child, little Emma, had begun to cling to her more than to her own parents. One evening, as Ameena tucked the girl into bed, Emma whispered, "Ameena, when you're here, the house feels warm." Those words pierced her heart because despite all the pain she carried, she had become a source of comfort for someone. It reminded her of her mother's gentle hands, of her childhood, of the warmth she had lost and was now giving to others. But with that warmth came responsibility, a responsibility that pulled her deeper into the family's life. She found herself balancing two worlds, the quiet suffering inside her heart and the soft love she gave to the child who depended on her. But Ameena didn't know that soon she would face a choice, one that would test her loyalty, her dreams, and her very identity. Weeks passed, and Ameena continued to pour her heart into her work, saving every possible dollar. But life had a cruel habit of testing her just when she felt stable. One late evening, while cleaning the living room, she overheard the parents discussing something that made her entire body freeze. They were planning to move to another state. If they moved, Ameena would lose her job, her room, her little sense of stability, and Emma, who saw her as a second mother. That night, Ameena sat quietly on the small bed in her tiny room, staring at her worn-out hands. "Why does life always shake the ground beneath my feet?" she whispered to herself. For a moment, she wondered if she should beg them to take her along, but then she remembered her purpose. She wasn't here to build comfort for herself. She was here to build a future for those little girls back home. What Ameena decided next would change the direction of her entire life forever. The next morning, Ameena walked into the kitchen with a calm face, though her heart felt like breaking. She informed the family politely that she understood their move and she would start looking for another job soon. The mother seemed surprised, almost taken aback by Ameena's strength. "You've been like family to us. We'll help you find a new place," she said softly. But Ameena simply smiled and shook her head. "I'll manage." Alane chahatu rasta kudban hai. That afternoon, while packing Emma's toys, the little girl hugged her tightly and asked, "Are you leaving me forever?" Ameena's throat closed as she held the child. "No, beta. The people we love never truly leave. They stay here," she said, touching Emma's tiny heart. As she walked out of the house for the last time, suitcase in hand, Ameena felt the weight of uncertainty, yet deep inside, a new fire began to rise. Little did Ameena know, the next door that opened for her would be far bigger than the one that just closed. Ameena found a small, temporary cleaning job at a local community center. The pay was low, the hours long, but the environment felt peaceful. Every afternoon, she noticed a group of children sitting outside the center, waiting for their parents who worked double shifts. Some did homework on the sidewalk, others simply stared at the ground. Their clothes were worn, their backpacks torn, and their eyes carried the silent stories of struggle. One little girl approached Ameena shyly and asked, "Auntie, do you know how to read this?" showing her a simple English worksheet. Ameena sat with her, explaining each word slowly, patiently. By the time she finished, 4 more children had gathered around her, listening, learning, smiling, and for the first time in a long while, Ameena felt needed again. What started as one small moment with one child was about to transform into something much larger than Ameena had ever imagined. The next day, the same children returned, this time with notebooks, sharpened pencils, and wide, hopeful eyes. "Auntie, will you teach us again?" one of them asked, almost afraid she might say no. Ameena smiled softly and nodded. Soon, more children joined. Kids from shelters, kids whose parents worked late-night jobs, kids who had no one at home to guide them. Word spread quietly, almost magically. "There's an auntie who teaches for free." Ameena began spending 2 hours every evening with them, teaching everything she knew: English, basic math, even simple life lessons about kindness and courage. She used scrap papers, broken pencils, and old books thrown away by others. Yet the children learned with a passion she had never seen before. And somewhere between those handwritten alphabets and innocent questions, Amina's old dream, once buried under years of hardship, began to wake up again. But dreams don't rise without tests, and the biggest test of Amina's life was just around the corner. One evening, as the children were packing their bags, a woman from the neighborhood approached Ameena. She looked annoyed, almost irritated. "You can't teach kids here," she said sharply. "This is a private area. People are complaining." The words hit Ameena like a stone. For a moment, she stood silently, her hands trembling. The children's faces fell instantly fearful, confused, unsure. Ameena tried explaining. "It's just for an hour. They have nowhere else to study." But the woman shook her head. "Rules are rules. If you want to teach, go somewhere else." The children clung to Amina's dupatta, not wanting this little world to disappear. That night, Ameena cried, not because she was scolded, but because she felt she was failing these children all over again. But just when everything seemed to fall apart, fate brought Ameena an unexpected path. The next morning, while Ameena was sweeping the marble floor of a wealthy employer's house, she overheard the lady of the home talking to her friend. "My servant has started teaching kids in the colony. Can you imagine? So ambitious," she said mockingly, but the friend replied softly, "Ambitious? I think it's beautiful. In fact, our company has a small community fund. We support people who help underprivileged children." Those words made Ameena pause. Her heart began to beat faster, but she quietly continued her work. A few minutes later, the friend walked toward Ameena and asked gently, "Is it true you teach children for free?" Ameena nodded shyly. The woman smiled. "I want to visit. Maybe we can help you." That was the first time in years Ameena felt hope return. Soft, fragile, but real. Little did she know that simple conversation would rewrite her destiny forever. That evening, the woman visited Ameena's small school, a tiny open space in the alley with 7 plastic chairs and 3 broken slates. Children sat eagerly, waiting for their Ameena miss. The woman's eyes softened as she watched them recite the alphabet with joy that came from nothing but love. After the class, she said, "Ameena, you are doing something extraordinary. You may not have money, but you have a heart the world needs." Then she made an offer Ameena never expected: sponsorship for books, uniforms, and a rented room that could become a proper classroom. Ameena stood speechless. No one had ever offered her help, not for herself, not for her dreams. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Madam, ye to main ne sapne main binahi sochata." The woman placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and replied, "Sapne tabi sachotehene, jabone pura carne wala sachilag mil jatehen." But Ameena had no idea. The biggest test of her courage was still waiting ahead. With the new support, Ameena rented a small room, its walls cracked, its roof leaking, but to her, it felt like a palace. She painted the walls herself, bought cheap floor mats, and arranged secondhand books like precious treasures on a wooden shelf. The children who once studied in an alley now sat inside their very first classroom. Parents from poor neighborhoods began sending their daughters too, saying, "Ameena Baji, Humain Barosa Hai Api Par." Every evening, after long days of housework, Ameena walked into that classroom tired, but the moment those little girls smiled and shouted, "Assalamu alaikum, miss," her exhaustion faded like it never existed. The school wasn't just growing, it was becoming a sanctuary for forgotten daughters. But destiny was preparing a challenge that could break everything she had built, if she let it. Just when the school was finally taking shape, Ameena's world trembled again. The landlord suddenly announced, "Next month se kiraya double hoga, warna jaga ka alikaro." Those words hit her like a storm. She didn't have extra money, not after sending savings back home and buying books for the children. That night, she sat alone in the empty classroom, listening to the faint echo of the girls' laughter that filled the room just hours earlier. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered to the silent walls, "Main and bachiyan ko fir sadat parnahi padne dungi, tahamuhe apne sahiyu maiden bekni pajayan." She had come too far to lose it all now, but the clock was ticking. In the next moment, an unexpected knock at the door changed the direction of her fight forever. Ameena wiped her tears and opened the door, unsure of who would be visiting at such an hour. Outside stood two of her oldest students, now grown, wearing college bags, eyes filled with worry and determination. Auntie, humain sab patashal gaya, one of them said softly. Abenye humare liye saldara salkitni kurbanian dihain. Q. Abhamari bairi hai. Before Ameena could speak, they placed an envelope in her hand. Inside was a small collection of money savings they had earned from part-time jobs. Yahi to bohot kamhai, the girl admitted. Lekin school band nahi hone denge. Hum sab milkar la denge. Hunchesi. Hum sab milkar la denge. Hamina's hands trembled as she held their contributions, a mixture of coins, crumpled bills, and overwhelming love. For the first time in weeks, she felt her knees weaken not from fear, but from gratitude. But this was only the beginning, as the next sunrise brought a miracle Ameena had never dared to dream of. The next morning, Ameena walked toward the school expecting silence and emptiness, but what she saw instead made her freeze in disbelief. Huh! More than 50 people, parents, shopkeepers, rickshaw drivers, tailors, laborers, even a few strangers, stood outside the rusty gate. Some carried paint buckets, some brought bricks, and some held small donations wrapped in newspaper. One elderly man stepped forward and said, "Behen, apne saere mahul ko badal dia, apne hamare bashonko ume dia." Ab yesku gurnay nahi denge. Tears rolled down Amina's face as the community surrounded her, offering not just money, but their time, their effort, and their hearts. She realized this. Little school was no longer hers. It belonged to every person whose life had been touched by her kindness. But even with all this support, a final test was still waiting, one that would determine whether the school could truly survive. Just when the repairs had begun and hope was returning to every corner of the small building, a government officer arrived unexpectedly. His stern expression and the papers in his hand made everyone fall silent. He announced that the land documents had a technical issue, and without immediate clearance, the school could still be shut down. The crowd murmured in panic. Ameena felt her heart drop after everything. Was this where her dream would end? But before she could speak, one of the older students stepped forward. "Sir," he said politely but firmly, "ye school ne human satkon se utakar zindagi dihai. Please, ek mauka dijiye." The officer paused, something in the boy's trembling voice, or perhaps in the sight of the entire community standing united behind Ameena, softened him. Slowly he lowered the papers and said, "Men kush karne ki koshish karta hoon, lekin ab sabko milkar saith dena hoga." A wave of relief swept through everyone. This wasn't the end yet, but before hope could fully settle, one more unexpected moment arrived, a moment that would change everything forever. 2 weeks later, as the school prepared for its reopening ceremony, Ameena arrived early to set up the chairs. The morning sun glowed softly across the courtyard, and she felt a rare calmness inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. But as she bent down to place a small flower vase on the front table, a sudden dizziness washed over her. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred, and before she could call out for help, her legs gave way. The children who arrived minutes later found her collapsed on the ground, barely conscious. Panic erupted. Someone ran to call an ambulance. Others surrounded her, crying, "Ameena, auntie, Euthane! Oh, apti ko jayengi." At the hospital, the doctor explained gently that exhaustion, stress, and years of physical labor had finally taken a toll on her failing health. Ameena blinked slowly, her voice faint but steady as she whispered, "Manik ho jangi, basmir basonki padhai rumni nahi chahiye." Even in that fragile state, her heart beat only for her students. But what happened next in the hospital room became the moment that sealed her legacy forever. As Ameena lay weak on the hospital bed, thinking she had reached the end of her strength, the door slowly opened. One by one, her students walked in, holding handmade cards, notebooks, and small flowers they had picked from nearby streets. But what broke her completely was the sight behind them. Dozens of parents, neighbors, local shopkeepers, even the officer who had once threatened to shut the school down. They all stood around her bed as if she were the pillar holding their entire world together. A young girl stepped forward, eyes shining with tears, and said, "Ameena auntie, apumin school banane wali teacher nahi malad tiho, apumat harengi tohum sikna kaya sekenge." The room filled with quiet sobs. Even the doctor, standing silently near the door, wiped his eyes. For the first time, Ameena wasn't alone in her fight. She realized that the school she built had built something in return, an entire community of people who now stood ready to carry her dream forward. And what happened on the day she finally returned to school became the most emotional moment of her entire life. 3 weeks later, when Ameena finally returned to the small school she had built with decades of tears, sacrifice, and hope, she expected only a quiet welcome. But as she stepped through the gate, the entire courtyard erupted with cheers. Garlands hung from the walls, the children held up handmade banners, and a big cloth sign stretched across the entrance read, "Welcome back, our hero." Ameena froze. Her eyes filled instantly. The girls who once had no notebooks now stood confidently with books pressed to their hearts. The boys who once wandered the streets now lined up in clean uniforms. And the community people she had once helped silently stood together, clapping for the woman who had changed their lives forever. The oldest girl took the mic and said, "Aaje saye sev skul nahi, Ameena Foundation Hai." Ameena covered her mouth with trembling hands as the crowd chanted her name. In that moment, she understood something she had never dared to believe. Her sacrifices had not disappeared into silence. They had grown into a future brighter than anything she had imagined. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe, because somewhere out there, another Ameena is fighting alone, waiting for her story to be heard.